Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu, Blume. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco has kicked off. And while there is a heavy list of things to talk about, all eyes will be on the meeting between President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, expected to take place Wednesday. Joining me to talk about what's at stake is Craig Stronberg. Craig, welcome.
Thank you.
There is a lot to talk about with the APEC meeting, but I think everybody is going to be focused on the U.S.-China talks. And every news report I've read talks about how there is so much at stake. And why don't we start there? What exactly is at stake?
A lot's at stake because if you look at what businesses have been telling us for the last 3-4 years, right, there's this list of rotating things that are at the top, 3 slots, right? It goes back and forth between U.S.-China relations, protectionism, and supply chain. 1, 2, 3 sort of shift. They all have to do with what is taking place at this meeting. Because in one way or another, they really all have to do with U.S.-China relations. And businesses in the U.S. and globally have gone through this roller coaster where we went through the trade war, we had some suspicion of the trade war, and now it's sort of uncertain where things are. So anytime that those two folks can sit down in person, it's likely to lead, at least temporarily, to a sigh of relief for businesses and countries, because they're almost certain to get things done because of all the advanced preparation that went into it.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because this meeting does not happen too often. The last time these two met was a year ago in Bali. And so what are the priorities of each country coming into this meeting?
So I'll answer the question in 1 minute, but one thing that I think viewers should understand is that while it is true it's been a year, I think these two individuals talk privately far more than is acknowledged, right? Certainly not in person, but they have a very old and established relationship that goes back 30 years. I think in some ways, despite their differences and their different points of view, these two individuals genuinely trust one another to keep their word in ways that many two leaders on the world stage today don't. And so even if they don't see one another very often, I think the fact that they do communicate pretty regularly is a good thing. But each of them, as you say, is sort of coming into this with something else in mind. Xi is coming into this with a less robust economy than he would have liked, right? Which may limit what he can do in terms of his asks and how bold he can be with those asks. But he's also coming in as, in his eyes, sort of being the representative of the Asia-Pacific Western side, right? Which nobody elected him to that post, right? The Vietnamese and the Japanese don't proclaim him as that. But as China sees it, right, they are the regional Asian economic and political power. And they do want things to benefit the whole region. And so there is a regional point of view that I think Xi is also going to bring to this that I don't think is always recognized.
Sure.
But the other is, I think they're trying to lay the groundwork, both Xi and Biden, for things to continue to be relatively smooth.
Okay.
So, I mean, you've seen, as we've talked about on the show previously, scores of very senior and mid-level US and Chinese officials go back and forth the Pacific. If we see that continue afterward, it means that the dialogue is working. I think President Biden is coming into this with a couple of different things. So one of those things is that he's trying to convince Xi that he's not decoupling.
Right.
That what the US is doing from a policy point of view is de-risking. This is going to be tricky because in kind of some ways the US is selectively decoupling, especially in the technology sector. And the US is talking with a lot of US companies about if they should be changing the way they operate or sell or manufacture in China. And so he's going to be coming and trying to keep this tricky balance with Xi of let's keep talking, let's keep partnering, even though Xi knows in the background the US is having those conversations.
Right.
But I also think it's important for Biden to demonstrate that these two countries can get along. Because the biggest of the world's problems, things like climate change, those don't get solved in the next 10, 20, 30 years unless the US and China are more than just cooperative.
Right.
They actually have to be partners.
Right.
And I think both of these individuals want to lay the framework for that now.
Okay, and I want to go back to de-risking because we have talked about this quite a bit in terms of a company perspective and what the priorities are, because the issues for companies in that region have evolved significantly since the start of the pandemic. So as companies are watching this meeting and looking for perhaps cues or anything like that, what are their priorities?
So I think what they're looking for is to see, is there going to be, at the very least, no elevation in U.S.-China tensions, but ideally, look, anytime you get those two in a room and you get them on the same picture shaking hands, there's almost certain to be a positive effect, at least temporarily. Mm-hmm. I think they are looking for that. I think they're looking for validation for that, because most companies, including U.S. companies, do not want to leave the Chinese market, right? It has immense gravity, immense opportunity, amazing talent pools. They don't want to leave, but there are two forces of gravity that are increasingly making them consider shifting parts of their operation. One of those gravities is in China, and that is a deteriorating regulatory environment, a deteriorating economic environment, and demographic and political signals in the background that don't appear very positive.
Right.
The US gravity that is sort of forcing them to make some change is the US government quietly talking with companies, saying maybe you should reconsider how you're positioned in China, but also dramatically increasing US protectionism over the last two administrations, making it harder for many US companies to do what they want to do in China.
And they've got to have a backup plan.
They've got to have a backup plan, which is where all those other countries in APEC, that nobody's talking about, because all their leaders are going to be there too.
Right.
That's where they come in, because increasingly, if you are thinking of shifting something out of China, there are lots of places you can think about. People are thinking about Mexico, Eastern Europe, but increasingly emerging Asia is really what they're thinking about and is probably going to benefit the most. And so those countries are also there. And those countries, like the Chinese, are also going to be talking to hundreds of global companies at this event, right? Trying to entice them to come regardless of the status of US-China relationships.
Right. All right. So my final question for you, I know that whenever I walk away from a conversation with you, I want to walk away with some comforting advice. So you talk to companies a lot. What are perhaps some considerations they should be having ahead of this meeting, through this meeting, and beyond?
So I think one of the things is that, look, whether you call this region the Asia Pacific or APEC or the Indo-Pacific, whatever you call it, this is where it's going to be at macroeconomically and geopolitically for the next portion of the century. It has the highest economic growth. It has the highest economic integration in many ways. It's got the world's two largest, outside of the EU trade pacts. It's increasingly dynamic. It's got very advantageous demographics. There's huge amounts of investment in FDI flowing in. But a lot of companies don't know Malaysia or Indonesia or Vietnam or Thailand nearly as well as they may know India or China. And so using the summit and watching what comes out of it as an entry point to really understand those markets and their advantages, their challenges for businesses is really going to be important, because this is kind of a race. These markets and their capabilities are not infinite, right? And you don't want to be the last one to invest in manufacturing in Vietnam.
Right.
Because there just isn't unlimited capability.
Right.
Like there seems to be in places like China.
Right.
So you have to act with some dispatch. And I think the other thing that we will probably see APEC sort of lead to is, I hope, is trying to understand more of the world's macroeconomic and geopolitical problems from their point of view. This is really important when US businesses talk to them. They see the world very differently than we do.
Right.
And they see the US and its role in the world often very differently than US citizens and US businesses do. APEC is a good chance to start to understand that, because if you can bring that about as you talk to them and you negotiate with them and you invest in them, your reception is going to be better.
Right. Craig, thank you so much. Helpful as always and insightful. And we're going to keep an eye on this meeting. I know you are, so would love to have you back for some post-meeting analysis.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us. Stay with Policy on Demand for the latest developments from Washington and around the world. Take care.